Education in China is a state-run system of public education run by the Ministry of Education. All citizens must attend school for at least 9 years, known as the 9-year compulsory education, which the government funds. It includes 6 years of primary education, starting at age 6 or 7, and 3 years of junior secondary education for ages 12 to 15. Some provinces may have 5 years of primary school but 4 years for middle school. After middle school, there are 3 years of high school, which then completes the secondary education. The Ministry of Education reported a 99% attendance rate for primary school and an 80% rate for both primary and middle schools. In the early 1980s, the government allowed the establishment of the first private school, increasing the number of undergraduates and people who hold doctoral degrees fivefold from 1995 to 2005. In 2003, China supported 1,552 institutions of higher learning and their 725,000 professors and 11 million students. There are over 100 national key universities, including Peking University and Tsinghua University. Chinese spending has grown by 20% per year since 1999, now reaching over $100 billion. And as many as 1.5 million science and engineering students graduated from Chinese universities in 2006. China published 184,080 papers as of 2008. China has also become a top destination for international students. As of 2013, China is the most popular country in Asia for international students, and ranks third overall among countries. Laws regulating the system of education include the Regulation on Academic Degrees, the Compulsory Education Law, the Teachers' Law, the Education Law, the Law on Vocational Education, and the Law on Higher Education. See also, Law of the People's Republic of China. Although Shanghai and Hong Kong are among the top performers in the program for international student assessment, China's educational system has been criticized for its rigorousness, as well as its emphasis on rote memorization and test preparation. History. Since the end of the Cultural Revolution, the education system in China has been geared toward economic modernization. In 1985, the national government ceded responsibility for basic education to local governments through the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party's decision on the reform of the educational structure. In unveiling the Education Reform Plan in May 1985, the authorities called for 9 years of compulsory education and the establishment of the State Education Commission. Official commitment to improved education was nowhere more evident than in the substantial increase in funds for education in the 7th five-year plan, which amounted to 72% more than funds allotted to education in the previous plan period. In 1986, some 16.8% of the state budget was earmarked for education, compared with 10.4% in 1984. Since 1949, education has been a focus of controversy in China. As a result of continual intra-party realignments, official policy alternated between ideological imperatives and practical efforts to further national development. But ideology and pragmatism often have been incompatible. The Great Leap Forward and the socialist education movement sought to end deeply rooted academic elitism, to narrow social and cultural gaps between workers and peasants and between urban and rural populations, and to eliminate the tendency of scholars and intellectuals to disdain manual labor. During the Cultural Revolution, universal fostering of social equality was an overriding priority. The post-Mao Zedong Chinese Communist Party leadership viewed education as the foundation of the four modernizations. In the early 1980s, science and technology education became an important focus of education policy. By 1986, training skilled personnel and expanding scientific and technical knowledge had been assigned the highest priority. The reorientation of educational priorities paralleled Deng Xiaoping's strategy for economic development. Emphasis also was placed on the further training of the already educated elite, who would carry on the modernization program in the coming decades. Renewed emphasis on modern science and technology led to the adoption, beginning in 1976, of an outward-looking policy that encouraged learning and borrowing from abroad for advanced training in a wide range of scientific fields. Beginning at the third plenum of the 11th National Party Congress Central Committee in December 1978, intellectuals were encouraged to pursue research in support of the four modernizations and, as long as they complied with the party's four cardinal principles, they were given relatively free rein. But where the party and the government determined that the strictures of the four cardinal principles had been stretched beyond tolerable limits, they did not hesitate to restrict intellectual expression. Literature and the arts also experienced a great revival in the late 1970s and 1980s. Traditional forms flourished once again, and many new kinds of literature and cultural expression were introduced from abroad. As of 2015, the government-operated primary and lower secondary schools in China have 28.8 million students. Development. Since the 1950s, China has been providing a 9-year compulsory education to what amounts to a fifth of the world's population. By 1999, primary school education had become generalized in 90% of China. A mandatory 9-year compulsory education now effectively covered 85% of the population. While the central and provincial governments provide some funding for education, this varies from province to province, and funding in the rural areas is notably lower than in major urban municipalities. Families must supplement monies provided to school by government with tuition fees, which means that some children have much less. However, parents place a very high value on education, and make great personal sacrifices to send their children to school and to university. Illiteracy in the young and mid-aged population has fallen from over 80% down to 5%. The system trained some 60 million mid- or high-level professionals and near 400 million laborers to junior or high school level. Today, 250 million Chinese get 3 levels of school education, doubling the rate of increase in the rest of the world during the same period. Net elementary school enrollment has reached 98.9%, and the gross enrollment rate in junior high schools 94.1%. China's educational horizons are expanding. 10 years ago the MBA was virtually unknown, but by 2004 there were 47,000 MBAs, trained at 62 MBA schools. Many people also apply for international professional qualifications. The education market has rocketed, with training and testing for professional qualifications, such as computer and foreign languages, thriving. Continuing education is the trend. Once in one's life, schooling has become lifelong learning. International cooperation and education exchanges increase every year. China has more students studying abroad than any other country. Since 1979, there have been 697,000 Chinese students studying in 103 countries and regions, of whom 185,000 have returned after finishing their studies. The number of foreign students studying in China has also increased rapidly. In 2004, over 110,000 students from 178 countries were studying at China's universities. Investment in education has increased in recent years. The proportion of the overall budget allocated to education has been increased by 1 percentage point every year since 1998. According to a Ministry of Education program, the government will set up an educational finance system in line with the public finance system, strengthen the responsibility of governments at all levels in educational investment, and ensure that their financial allocation for educational expenditure grows faster than their regular revenue. The program also set out the government's aim that educational investment should account for 4% of GDP in a relatively short period of time. For non-compulsory education, China adopts a shared cost mechanism, charging tuition at a certain percentage of the cost. Meanwhile, to ensure that students from low-income families have access to higher education, the government has initiated effective ways of assistance, with policies and measures of scholarships, work-study programs, subsidies for students with special economic difficulties, tuition reduction or exemption and state stipends. The government has committed itself to markedly raising educational levels generally, as evidenced in a Ministry of Education program. By 2020, of every 100,000 people, 13,500 will have had junior college education or above, and some 31,000 will have had senior high school schooling. Rates for illiteracy and semi-literacy rate will fall below 3%, and average schooling duration across the population will increase from today's 8 years to nearly 11. In the 2009 test of the Program for International Student Assessment, a worldwide evaluation of 15-year-old school pupils' scholastic performance by the OECD, Chinese students from Shanghai achieved the best results in mathematics, science and reading. The OECD also found that even in some of the very poor rural areas, the performance is close to the OECD average. However, controversy has surrounded the high scores achieved by the Chinese students due to the unusual spread of the numerical data, with suggestions that schools were gaming students for the exams. Also, while averages across the breadth of other countries are reported, China's rankings are taken from only a few select districts. Education policy. Before the defeat of the Kuomintang in 1949, education was effectively closed to workers, peasants, and generally females in practical terms, despite Sun Yat-sen's support of general education in principle. However, the Marxist ideology of the post-1949 government, in reacting to the overly literary and classical tradition of China, overstressed in turn practical applications, and the superior wisdom of the worker and peasant, whose hand skill was assumed to be the base to the superstructure of science and learning in general. This resulted in various experiments in which peasants and industrial workers were made teachers overnight but were unable to gain respect or communicate their knowledge. The new communist government created wide access to some form of education for all, except children of people under suspicion of land ownership and political unreliability. The possibility, however, of re-education and service to the masses was held out to bourgeois families as long as they committed to communism as well. This meant that even before the Cultural Revolution, there was a continuum in China between the prison, the re-education camp, and the school. Officially, the opportunity was extended to all classes to join China's project on its Leninist terms. In an attempt to make education more practical and accessible, Chinese characters were simplified for quick learning and by training people in skills they could use, including the basic medical training provided, barefoot doctors, actually paramedics that provided medical care, midwifery and instruction on the evils of foot binding and female infanticide in such rural areas where those practices still existed. The Chinese Communist government to some degree provided the goods to the bottom of society and for this reason received broad support before the Cultural Revolution from many people who formerly had been at the bottom. The general populace was unaware of, and indifferent to, the fate of intellectuals during the Great Leap Forward and the Hundred Flowers epochs of the late 1950s. The educational system and government of China eradicated opium, in part by education and also by harsh penalties which are still in use. But during the Cultural Revolution, higher education in particular suffered tremendous losses. The system was almost shut down, and a rising generation of college and graduate students, academics and technicians, professionals and teachers was lost. The result was a lack of trained talent to meet the needs of society. an irrationally structured higher education system unequal to the needs of the economic and technological boom, and an uneven development in secondary technical and vocational education. In the post-Mao period, China's education policy continued to evolve. The pragmatist leadership, under Deng Xiaoping, recognized that to meet the goals of modernization it was necessary to develop science, technology, and intellectual resources and to raise the population's education level. Demands on education, for new technology, information science, and advanced management expertise, were levied as a result of the reform of the economic structure and the emergence of new economic forms. In particular, China needed an educated labor force to feed and provision its 1 billion-plus population. By 1980, achievement was once again accepted as the basis for admission and promotion in education. This fundamental change reflected the critical role of scientific and technical knowledge and professional skills in the four modernizations. Also, political activism was no longer regarded as an important measure of individual performance, and even the development of commonly approved political attitudes and political background was secondary to achievement. Education policy promoted expanded enrollments, with the long-term objective of achieving universal primary and secondary education. This policy contrasted with the previous one, which touted increased enrollments for egalitarian reasons. In 1985, the commitment to modernization was reinforced by plans for 9-year compulsory education and for providing good quality higher education. Deng Xiaoping's far-ranging educational reform policy, which involved all levels of the education system, aimed to narrow the gap between China and other developing countries. Modernizing education was critical to modernizing China. The evolution of educational management from the central to the local level was the means chosen to improve the education system. Centralized authority was not abandoned, however, as evidenced by the creation of the State Education Commission. Academically, the goals of reform were to enhance and universalize elementary and junior middle school education, to increase the number of schools and qualified teachers, and to develop vocational and technical education. A uniform standard for curricula, textbooks, examinations, and teacher qualifications was established, and considerable autonomy and variations in and among the autonomous regions, provinces, and special municipalities were allowed. Further, the system of enrollment and job assignment in higher education was changed, and excessive government control over colleges and universities was reduced. However, the education system of the PRC still discourages innovation and independent thinking, causing delays in even such high-profile national projects as the JXX fifth-generation jet fighters.